All right. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Good evening. Thank you for coming this evening, joining us for our last lecture related to our wonderful special exhibition, Reframing the View, 19th-Century American Landscapes. The exhibition has been open since October 28th, and we are nearing our final weeks with this spectacular show. It is bittersweet to see it go. I hope you were able to explore and spend some time in it this evening before the talk, and that you remind friends and neighbors to come back and see it one more time as we head into these final weeks. I would also be remiss if I didn't note there are a couple great partnership walks that are being offered in the next couple weeks. We were able to partner with a number of local land trusts to offer free guided walks in some of the beautiful landscapes that we have here around us. So coming up on Saturday, there is a walk being offered at Dunham's Brook at the Westport Conservation Lands Trust. And then I believe it's the week following, it's May, that first Saturday in May, we have a walk happening in Marion at Sippican Lands Trust. So if you want to find out more about those and register, again, they're free, but they do want a head count. You can do that on our website. Tonight, though, we're going to talk really specifically about women in landscape and women within this exhibition. Think about how women in the 19th century created their own views and vistas in various media and for different kinds of audiences. And in so doing, they participated in popularizing the American landscape in art and culture. And we're going to look at some objects that are not traditional paintings. We're going to think about where women were in picturing American landscape well beyond the traditional oil on canvas, although we'll look at some of those too. But as we'll come to see, women were everywhere in picturing the American scene. But first, most well-known American landscape painters in the mid-1800s were men. If I asked people to name an artist from this period who pictured the landscape or pictured nature, the majority, including people from my field, art historians who know lots of art and lots of artists, are probably going to name a man, an artist like Thomas Cole, Asher B. Durand, or Frederick Edwin Church. So this raises a lot of questions, right? Where were the women? Were they out there painting the landscape? If they weren't, why not? If they were, why haven't their names or deeds been recorded? Why aren't they as well known as the men that we look to? Despite being faced with limited opportunities in the genre of art, and especially landscape painting, as we'll come to see, some women did carve out successful careers as professional artists, painting landscape and still life. Others worked as artisans in professional settings, decorating china, glass, and other kinds of decorative arts. Many practiced needle arts, domestic handicraft, decorated their homes with stitched outdoor scenes or floral motifs, and gave these designs as gifts or sold them as pieces to consumers. Most of these women also balanced the demands of motherhood, caregiving, and domestic labor. Female artists cultivated a widespread taste for American scenery in fine art and popular culture, and also as creators and consumers, right? The ones who most often made the choices about what was inside American homes, hanging on the walls, sitting on a table. It was women who brought the American landscape into the American home and made it popular. So we're going to think and try and find women throughout this evening, figure out how they found productive avenues to express their appreciation for the American landscape, and look at unexpected objects, perhaps, to identify what they were looking at and what they might have been thinking about. And ultimately, hopefully, we'll see that women did what they could and claimed space where they could, often in direct contradiction to the expectations of others. They did capture the American landscape and contributed to a national taste for it as a distinctly American genre. So we're going to start maybe in an unusual place. In 1788, with little 9-year-old Martha Patty Lewis Gowan. She worked a sampler with the phrase, "Heaven is our guard, and innocence its care, nor need the just the worst of danger fear." This phrase appeared in popular period juvenile exercise books that young girls would have been given to study from. It would have included biblical phrases, some facts about animals and plant life. It would have included little pieces that could have been stitched on to samplers like this one. This is worked with silk thread on linen. Again, Gowan was just 9 years old. And it demonstrates her marriageable skills and acumen, her Christian piety, and, depending on her economic status, denoted her as either a lady trained in the running of a household who could do this kind of work, right, when she came of age, or as someone fit for domestic service, if that was the class she came from. Women's lives were defined by their class, their social position, their marriageability, their domestic skills, and then later, husband and children. Boys and men, it's worth noting, did not stitch samplers. Mostly. Of course, we know from our maritime history, many of the sailors and whalers were great at needlework. Gowan likely did not consider herself an artist when creating this work either, and I'm not trying to argue that she did, but I think we could say she was one in some ways. It's also unlikely that she imagined a possible life outside the rigid expectations set for 18th century women. However, her sampler adopts key elements that are common to landscape art, indicating that these components were common knowledge and that they were adopted into household works like this. There's a vertical composition. There are stacked registers, these kind of bands that organize physical space. And the bottom half that you see here, blown up in incredible detail, thanks to the wonderful photography of Michael Lapides, shows two landscapes grounded by clearly defined horizon lines and connected by a stream of flowing water, which is that blue that runs through the middle. She stitches at least 4 different varieties of flowers, and strawberries appear throughout the piece. So you see these clusters here, which are these rich, red, juicy strawberries. The bottom corners are weighted by green-mounded hills that frame the space. And while this might not be a recognizable place, Gowan borrows from these pictorial conventions that were common to landscape. Now, this sampler has been in the Whaling Museum collection since 1947. And it was not until the preparation for this exhibition that we opened in October that we properly identified the maker and learned more about her life. She was initially somewhat hard to trace. There was a one-line record in a genealogy book, which you see here in the upper right, and not much else. Being a woman, tracing the genealogy of women can be a little tricky. Ultimately, we learned that Gowan was born during the American Revolutionary War in Boston, that she was one of 10 children of Dr. Joseph Gowan and Martha Goldthwaite, that her father was an apothecary, that the family settled in Weston, and that Patty, as she was known, married Charles Ricketson in the summer of 1800. The two lived in New Bedford, where he was a merchant, and while her husband's life is well documented, little is recorded about her, aside from her birth, marriage, and the records of her children, especially the boys, including their first son, Henry, who was born in December of 1800. Records indicate they may have had as many as 14 children that would have kept Patty quite busy with housework and child raising. Her husband's death in 1854 is marked by a lengthy record trail relating to property, distribution, and probate. She's mentioned once in that document. She was granted $2,000 and use of his properties during her natural life in lieu of dower, after which it was distributed to her sons. She died in 1860 in New Bedford at age 80. Now, why am I giving you the details of her life in this way? Well, it was tough to find them, which I think is indicative of how women's stories are recorded in histories. And also, her biography is defined by the men around her, by her father first, by her husband, and then by her sons. which to some may come as little surprise, but is an important lesson for us, right, in thinking about that key question that's going to drive us tonight. Where are the women? Why weren't they recorded? Now, what Patty did leave behind, aside from her family and their legacy, which continues generations on, are the material artifacts of a life confined to the domestic realm. Pieces like this one. In 1971, the art historian Linda Nochlin published an essay called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" This is considered a kind of canonical essay of feminist art history, which framed this entire sort of question as a part of the discipline. And in this essay, Nochlin argues that the historical absence of women in history is not due to a lack of talent or ambition. Instead, she argued in 1971 that the very structures of our society centered men and delimited opportunities for women, excluding them from the institutions that would have made them successful and preventing their professional acceptance and ascension. The universities, the associations, the clubs, the societies were all male-focused. The expectations, in addition, of marriage and the burdens of childbearing and mothering precluded many women from careers, including, to Linda's, Nochlin's point, professional artists. Women artists could not be admitted to art academies or university. They could not create legally binding contracts with clients. They could not manage their own money or property or engage patrons professionally. And the few female artists who did succeed were often written out of history, ridiculed, or undermined by later scholars. Frequently, you see the question, somebody else must have helped her paint that. She must have had a studio assistant. There must have been somebody else there doing the work. Now, Nochlin's leading question, which forms the title of the essay, is rhetorical. She wants you to start an answer, to frame a response, to get defensive and say, because. But that answer presumes that the question itself is based on a truth, right? That the supposition there is accurate, when in fact what she wants people to think about critically is what systemic barriers existed to prevent those potentially great women from achieving something in the first place. Oh, getting ahead of myself. Now, Linda Nochlin was talking in that essay most about artists in the Renaissance and the Baroque period, so artists in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. But today, gender-based disparities perpetuate the legacies of the past. The United States is one of the only nations in the world that does not mandate paid family leave, and the gender pay gap endures. White women make on average 83 cents for every dollar made by male counterparts, and that gap is much more pronounced for women of color. Black women make 63 cents and Hispanic women 57. The pay gap and the care burden impacting women restricts opportunities for many for true equality. And we've seen that vividly during the pandemic and the impact especially on women in the labor force. Historically, though, and to the context of our talk today, such prohibitions were magnified, meaning very few women were able to carve out successful careers as artists. And for women of color, such barriers were doubly challenging. So what were women supposed to do? Well, women's domestic duties in the 1800s were extensive. And between 1820 to 1860, we saw the rise in the United States of an idea of womanhood that is commonly known as the cult of domesticity. And it was a system of social beliefs that particularly impacted women, no matter their class, race, or background. It was defined by motherhood, piety, and purity, and essentially espoused that women should be measured by their ability to live up to an ideal, a sort of expectation. The role of wife and mother, to be pious, to be pure, to be submissive, and to be domestic. And the sphere or the domain of influence for women was completely confined to the home. Men, indeed, argued that women were biologically inferior, incapable of participating in external worldly affairs like politics, commerce, or public service. Husbands would provide the necessary security and protection for a wife, and in exchange, she would take on housekeeping, raising good children, and making the family home a haven. And this feminine ideal was disseminated in popular periodicals, in paintings, and in visual and material culture. The advice of good housekeeping handbooks, the texts of sermons and lectures, and even political speeches. And so here are just 3 examples of the ways in which women in the 1800s would have come to understand that these expectations were held for them, right? And then they would feel the burden to fulfill them. You know, as we do, right? We understand we're meant to do something, and we try to live up to those expectations. So we have things like Godey's Lady's Book, which was one of the most popular periodicals at mid-century in the United States. It reached a peak circulation of 150,000 households, and it was kind of the popular magazine, women's magazine of the day. It included, as you'll see, fashion plates, designs for dresses, advice about good housekeeping, little snippets about the news of the day. So it was very much the women's magazine. And you can see here this lovely kind of domestic scene of women keeping busy at home with good hobbies, music, reading, ladylike things. Lily Martin Spencer is a fabulous example of an artist who really upheld the ideal of womanhood. She was a successful female painter in the mid-19th century in America. She did mostly genre scenes, so scenes of everyday life. And she's particularly known for her domestic scenes that uphold ideal family values, ideal womanhood, and ideal motherhood. So this scene is called Domestic Happiness. You have the sweet children have fallen asleep, and the mother and the father look over them, and the mother kind of reaches up to stop the husband from saying something, because, you know, silly husband is going to wake these kids up. And she says, shush, 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 you know, they're sleeping. Lily Martin Spencer is a really interesting example, though, of a female artist who upheld these ideals and presented them for audiences, but she herself was an avid feminist. She had a really unusual marriage in this period. She was raised as a Fourier, which was this follower of this kind of sect that was popularized in France that saw espoused gender equality. And so she was raised in a family where her father and her mother both had equal weight in the household and caregiving duties. And then she married a man who kept house and raised all, I believe there were 7 children, while she went out as a professional artist and brought home the bacon, so to speak. So she painted pictures like this, but then at home had this really interesting kind of reversed life. Finally, on the right, we see an image of a column that was written by Anne Orr for Good Housekeeping. Anne Orr was the leading kind of needlepoint handcraft expert in the first half of the 20th century. And she did these columns in Good Housekeeping, which, of course, as you probably know, Good Housekeeping continues. They have a whole institute, right? They really kind of study what it means to keep a good house. And Orr's columns presented all sorts of different patterns that people could follow, and you could get your issue of Good Housekeeping, and it would give you a new pattern to stitch. And many of them are flowers, landscape scenes, nature scenes. Orr is interesting as well. She was widowed, and she uses her needlepoint to essentially kind of become a businesswoman unto herself and supports her entire family on the salary from that work. So, columns in women's magazines with these big circulations preyed upon expectations about the divisions of domestic labor and the dangers of idle hands. Women, as noted, managed the home and children, and domestic decoration, especially handcrafted items, also fell on a wife's plate. One 1868 issue of Godey's Lady's Book listed 80 items of attire and 61 pieces of work, including a gentleman's waistcoat and boy's braces, that the reader could learn to make themselves from a pattern. Now remember, this book came out every month, so that's a lot of patterns to try and master. Embroidery patterns for Berlin woolwork circulated widely, and we see an example of one of those patterns here in the middle. It was popularized in everything from slippers and bell pulls to bags and cushions. It was developed in Germany, this style of needlework in the 1800s, and it was hard wearing and it was brightly dyed. So I think you can see the vivid colors in the examples on either side. These are wedding braces, which would have been created for an important family event. They would have been stitched with these bright colors and would have been worn by a male family member at a wedding. And these are two examples of wedding braces with this stitchery that are in our collection. And again, they're incredible kind of floral patterns that give you a sense that women were looking at nature while they were also looking at sources, right? And responding to natural motifs as much as they could. Now, needlepoint was, again, a kind of common domestic duty. For the unknown stitcher of a fire screen of about 1870, the natural landscape offered an outdoor environment to admire from the confines of home. It's possible, we learned this only through the exhibition and the presentation of this fire screen from the collection, that this may be the same one donated to the museum in 1927, by the daughter of Maria Louisa Sampson Ricketson. We had someone write to us and say, I think I've seen that fire screen in this historic photograph. And again, this is a story of a piece in the collection that was donated to the museum, but which wasn't as carefully researched. It was women's work. It hadn't been as valued historically in the museum's past. Now, fireplace screens like that moved up and down on a pole depending on the position of the person it shielded. They kept dangerous sparks and embers from jumping into the room, a necessity that prevented tragedies like the death of Fanny Longfellow, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's wife, whose hoop skirt went up in flames when she got close to the fire. Fire screens also shielded residents from the glare and heat of the fire, and this was important for women who were perceived as delicate and whose clothing and corseting traditionally meant that they were more affected by closed spaces and warm temperatures. They couldn't breathe, they were hot, and they were encumbered by lots of layers of fabric. Indeed, corseting in women's fashion more generally had disastrous effects on women's health and constitutions. Certain styles of corseting literally changed their anatomy. Ribs shifted, lungs compressed, and organs moved back and down. The layers they wore, bustle pads, full skirts, crinoline petticoats, and bonnets, meant they were often overheated and weighted down by fabric, horsehair, and hoops. Women were literally immobilized and imperiled by their own clothing. And I think you see that vividly in this fashion plate illustration from Godey's Ladies book on the left, where they are so straight and rigid. Can you imagine standing in such a way? Now, without freedom of movement, women, especially those of a certain class, were really limited in where they could go. Now, a fire, though, of course, may have been dangerous. It may have made life difficult in some ways, but it was imperative for life pre-electricity. And among many purposes, the light from a fire aided women in executing all those detailed domestic handicrafts that they had to do in the evening after those children went to bed. One imagines the maker of this screen patiently working the scene into being, drawing the animals out from the background fabric using careful stitchery. Such activities may have been a creative release for the maker, a practice piece assigned by a mother or caregiver, a point of pride put on prominent display in a parlor, or just one of the many more duties in a life filled with domestic chores. It could also have been worked as a piece for sale or charity, thereby representing an opportunity for financial or social independence. And in this case, I think it's interesting, we see a family group, an idyllic pastoral scene with an alert father standing, paying attention, a round-bellied mother, and two young children. Now, that the natural landscape and its flora and fauna proved so popular as a design motif with women, who themselves were mostly constrained to the domestic sphere, is somewhat ironic. They pictured scenes of freedom and the outdoors, but were often barred from it. Now, in response to the oppression of women, the woman movement that emerged in the United States in the mid-1800s aimed to change expectations about female value through social action. And that included things like the suffrage movement, higher education, which opened career paths in teaching, nursing, and office work, and also economic and civic freedoms. Another front line for change was around advocacy for joint property distribution, the monetization of domestic duties, and protest over the very kind of decorative labor we've just been looking at and talking about. By 1860, increasingly local legislation enabled women's rights over earnings outside the home, but material service, domestic duties, remained uncompensated. Legal historian Reva Siegel has designated the uncompensated labor facing women in this period as including, quote, the work of childcare, cooking, sewing, washing, marketing, and house maintenance that rural and urban women shared. And notes how Lydia Maria Child, for example, supported herself and her husband by writing, but her diary also noted the manufacture of 36 pieces of clothing, 17 items of household furnishings, and the preparation of 722 meals, all as a part of a year's work. Now, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, another female author, argued in 1898 in her book Women and Economics that, quote, wives as earners through domestic service are entitled to the wages of cooks, housemaids, nursemaids, seamstresses, and housekeepers. Despite the momentum of the movement for social and legal enfranchisement and the success of white women's suffrage in the United States in 1919, women's gains inside and outside the house remained slow, and the burdens of housework and domestic duties limited possible advancement. And of course, the women's movement, there was a massive backlash, right? And a lot of visual and verbal responses to it. And you're seeing examples on the left of some of those, which is this idea of kind of a world gone topsy-turvy. If women are given the right to vote, they're going to be out in the public sphere, and the men are going to have to come home and take care of the house and do the embroidery and the handicrafts and take care of the children. So you see two of these kind of trade cards, right? Little cards that are showing this world turned upside down. And then on the right, you see women campaigning for suffrage here, including Nanny Helen Burroughs at the left, who is holding the suffrage sign. Now, as explored, women's domestic contributions to the household were wide-ranging. In addition, some women participated in the creation of mass-produced goods that carried the aura of hand production but were made in an industrial setting outside the home or as piecework inside the home. They were produced by women for the commercial market. In 1853, again, Godey's Lady's Book, presented the difference between the woman who does household handicrafts for her own pleasure and the seamstress who must labor for her livelihood. I'll give you a minute, see if you can figure out the difference here. On the left side, we have the woman who does needlework for her pin money. And on the right, we have the woman doing work for needle money. Now you can tell the judgment here that's being made, right, by Godey's Lady's Book. We have a lush, lovely interior, a woman who has a lady's maid, and she's doing handicrafts and selling them so she can buy lovely things and, have just a little bit extra in her purse. Now the poor woman here on the right, the seamstress working for needle money, she's in an attic, she has sunken, hollow eyes, she looks rather sickly, and she's, trying to stitch as fast as she can here, right, to make as much as she can. Respectable wage-paying jobs for women included work in the textile and clothing sector, what were called the needle trades, and in metalware and pottery production. Some women often ended up shouldering the double burden of working full-time and tending house. In 1900, however, only 21% of all American women worked for wages, and they comprised just 18% of the total U.S. labor force. About half of those women had jobs as domestic servants or as unskilled factory workers. Now, examples of work produced under these conditions and very possibly made by women makers include oval bandboxes decorated with landscape scenes of pheasants in a forest, a picturesque farmhouse, and winding road. Another shows a city street with a volunteer fire brigade pushing a pump truck to an elaborate house. Bandboxes were essentially kind of the tote bag of the 1800s. If you had a place to go, you could grab one off the shelf and toss some things in it. If you were going away for a weekend, you'd pack your stuff up. You could hold things in it in the house, but it could also be taken with you elsewhere. Bandboxes are made mostly with wallpapers. Some of those are imported, but some of them would have been stamped, probably by women, lined, and then mounted. The 1830 paper hanging manufactory of New Bedford recorded wages for 4 men and 12 women. And as might be expected, men made $1 a day, while women made 50 cents. Often constructed of pasteboard and covered with this hand-blocked wallpaper, printed bandboxes showed landscapes frequently in their scenery. And these 3 from our collection had, as far as we know, never been exhibited before this exhibition. While bandboxes were created often in concert with wallpaper companies to use up scraps in a cottage industry, one source has claimed that female entrepreneurs were responsible for most bandbox production. And in particular, Hannah Davis was the most famous female manufacturer of bandboxes. She worked in New Hampshire and for over 30 years sold bandboxes to young women who worked in the textile mills in Nashua, Manchester, and Lowell. Bandboxes demonstrate 2 important points. First, women were engaged in a variety of work at home and in cottage industries like the production of these goods. And such goods as these were popular with female consumers and decorated and adorned with scenes that tend toward landscape or flowers and foliage, underscoring the fact again that nature was a popular decorative subject. China painting and decoration were another area where women tended to dominate the workforce for piecework and in more traditional factory settings, and where nature was again a popular subject of decoration. Women of various classes and backgrounds hand-painted china for personal use or for sale, depending again on their class. One particularly charming example of hand-painted soft-paste porcelain is a handless cup and matching saucer from a Staffordshire pearlware and strawberry pattern set. And the unique hand decoration, which you can imagine a woman painting in the decorating studio, traces squiggling curly cues of red, springy lines, yellow-seeded round red berries, and 2-toned strawberry leaves. Women comprised about 40% of the Staffordshire ceramic factory workforce. Most served as decorators or paintresses or attendants to the male potters, helping them out on the floor. They undertook myriad kinds of work, including on semi-skilled repetitive tasks like slip casting and also transfer printing of decorative tableware. And we see here a mezzotint on the left that shows a female figure hand painting a teapot, the factory bottle kiln out the window belching smoke, and we get a clear scene of kind of the labors of these paintresses in Staffordshire. They worked very long hours executing detailed designs on the surface of vessels. Women also worked not just in hand painting, but in transferware production, including for the Stevenson brothers, who were a trio of factory transferware producers who began in Staffordshire, England. Andrew's largest market, however, was in the United States, where he immigrated to New York City in 1823 and set up a shop. And he started creating transferware wares that showed scenes in New York City as well as in Massachusetts. Several of the patterns show scenes like this one, a view of New York from the heights near Brooklyn. And while the Stevenson brothers certainly relied on women's labor in their Staffordshire factories, they also would have used shop girls in their New York City store, another place where women were promoting landscape and nature as subjects for decorative arts in transactions with consumers. Finally, women worked in glass production and decoration, where they were likely paid by the piece for their work. In the 1880s at Sandwich Glassworks, for example, the decorating, etching, and cutting departments were largely made up of young women around the age of 20, unmarried. When they would have married, they probably would have left work and gone to tend house. The Pearpoint and Mount Washington glass companies in New Bedford followed a similar demographic in their employment patterns. Only one woman that's known carved out a professional career as a glass inspector, which was above the level of a kind of decorator or a hand worker, and that was Abby Wheeler, who served as a glass inspector in the 1870s at the factory. It's plausible then that a rare Ambero art glass vase would have been decorated by a female hand. These were only produced for a few years, around 1915, and sent to the lamp department to be decorated inside rather than outside. This one shows a pastoral landscape with tall trees, a cottage, and two women walking along an open path. When illuminated from within, the rich orange color of the glass transforms into vivid lime green, giving the scene an altogether modern appearance. And if you peeked in the landscape show earlier before this talk, you would have seen that we have two of them. One stays in its original form as a vase, and one was turned into a lamp. And so you can see the difference in the coloring there. The middle photograph here is from our collection, and it shows the women decorators at Pearpoint in the studio. And you can see that that entire room is women working on glass. Now, women, regardless of background or class, still adhered to and were subject to the domestic duties and ideals of womanhood. They created various forms of decorative arts for personal use and ornament, as well as factory production or piecework. More generally, though, these women were consumers, and this is, again, a point I want to make. And in that role, they were integral to establishing the visual iconography and subject matter of commercial goods and patterns, again, of popularizing landscape and nature. As the family member tasked with decorating the domestic sphere, they influenced what was commercially possible, what was commercially popular, and in turn influenced what was produced. So in large part, it was because of female consumers that we see so much landscape and nature. And so here again are some examples that show you kind of the domestic sphere and the ways in which women would have had influence over what was being purchased, how homes were decorated, how gardens, were incorporated into homes. So that's kind of the first half of our journey today, to think about women and these kind of handicrafts, creating household wares within the commercial sphere and the domestic sphere. For the next part, I want to talk a little bit about those professional artists that managed to carve out careers, painting landscape and nature scenes. So those who sought professional training and success. American women rarely received formal academic training in art before the 1870s. Between 1820 and 1870, most could take courses in art as a method of feminine improvement and to demonstrate their accomplishments. But true professional training was challenging, and this was for a number of reasons. The first one was that the academies that kind of determined how you could be trained as an artist, and then if you were approved as an academician, and if you could show in their public exhibits, therefore finding patrons, therefore selling your work and building a client base, those were really male professional organizations. And they had these very strict structures of what kinds of scenes different kind of artists could paint. So these are the hierarchies of genre. And you could be a portrait artist, you could be a still life artist, you could be a landscape artist. But the greatest artist of all in the 1820s, 30s, 40s was a history painter. And these were people who were painting the great scenes of history. And to do that effectively, you had to be able to study the human body. And at the art academies, to study the human body, you studied the nude human body. And women were absolutely barred from doing that, not just societal mores, but also they could not enroll in the classes. And so that really restricted the opportunities women had and the kinds of things they could paint. So if they did enter the fine arts or attempt to become a professional artist, they were really limited to the lower genres: miniature painting, still lifes, or work as decorative painters. Women who did manage to achieve success in these fields had the support often of a male family member or a husband who themselves would have trained these women artists or worked with them in the same business. Others adopted male pseudonyms or signed pictures with a first initial rather than gender themselves to jurors or audiences. And some male professional artists took on female students on the side in their studios, while women of means frequently opted to leave the United States to train and work abroad in Rome or Paris, where they could enroll at a number of schools, including the Académie Julian and Académie Colarossi in Rome, which were both art academies that accepted women in the 1850s and 60s. The Royal Academy in London opened to women in the 1860s as well, and the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris accepted women in the 1890s. Now, by contrast, American art institutions were much slower to accept women. The National Academy of Design did not begin admitting women as students until 1846, and even then, women only made up 6% of those exhibiting in their public exhibitions between 1826 and 1860. So over a period of 34 years, at one of the biggest public art exhibitions in the United States at the National Academy of Design, only 6% of the exhibitors were women. By the 1870s, however, fine art schools were opening up to women. And that was for a few different reasons. You see an image here on the left of the women's life class at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1879. In Massachusetts, one of the big things that opened up opportunities for women to study art and become professional artists was the passage of what was known as the Massachusetts Drawing Act, which was passed in 1872, and it was a state law that mandated that all children in the state, in the Commonwealth, had to be trained in drawing and art. And it was a law that was passed in order to train up in the industrial arts the next generation of laborers and workers who would go into the design and the trade fields, working in factories like Mount Washington, Pearpoint, and others, going to the textile mills and doing that work. But what it meant is there had to be people to teach them in every single one of the schools across the state of Massachusetts. And that's the founding of Mass Art, Mass Normal, which was the first higher ed free public art school in the state of Massachusetts, was to train women to be teachers, to teach children how to draw. So the 1870s transforms women's opportunities in the arts. But before that, you had to kind of take what you could find. So these first female artists who are working, some of them in the 1830s, 1840s, they're most often getting their training and entering the art world because they come from a family of artists. They have an uncle who's an artist, a father who's an artist, a brother who's an artist. And so we see this throughout examples of women who are successful. The Philadelphia-based Peale family is a really good example of this. The head of the family is Charles Wilson Peale, who is a very well-known turn of the 19th century artist. He founds the first public museum in the United States in Philadelphia, and he has a number of children, all of whom he aspirationally names things like Titian and Raphael, who he trains up to become artists themselves. And then the generations flow forward from there. So Charles Wilson Peale's son, James Peale, becomes a successful still life painter, and then his niece, Margaretta Angelica Peale, becomes a successful still life painter, learning from him, and then his grandniece, Anna Sellers, becomes a successful still life painter. And you'll see actually this painting by Anna Sellers from 1875 is titled Still Life with Oval China Bowl after James Peale, her uncle. So she was there copying his paintings to learn how to do it, and then selling them, exhibiting and selling them publicly. Now for these two women, Anna and Margaretta, in a family of many generations of artists who took that profession seriously and saw it as a kind of open opportunity for anyone, becoming an artist was a natural step. But that was not the case for others. Claude Regé Hurst and Adelheid Dietrich, who we'll talk about in a minute, were both committed still life artists. They forged careers expressly focused on the genre of still life. Hurst studied in Cincinnati, where she exhibited trompe-l'oeil illusionistic still lifes under the name Claude. She was born as Claudine, starting in the 1870s. Her pseudonym likely aimed to defy gender expectations and avoid criticism based on her sex. Exhibiting as Claude rather than Claudine opened up ambiguity about who exactly this artist was. And remember, most of these pictures during this period in the 1800s, you were painting your picture, you would send it off to a big exhibition. It would be hung with a couple hundred other works. Somebody would come to the public exhibition, they would get a little paper guidebook, would have a list with the numbers, name of the artist, title, and whether the work was for sale or not. And that was it. So it wasn't like there was biographical information. You had no way of knowing the sex of the artist except interpreting their name. So here is Claudine, aka Claude, exhibiting their still lifes, beginning in Cincinnati. She then moved to New York City in 1880 with her sister and her mother, and married landscape artist William Crothers Fittler, who encouraged her in her career because he was also a painter and an artist. she joined both the Women's Art Club of New York and the American Watercolor Society, and exhibited still lifes like this 1885 painting of peaches to enormous acclaim. And it's worth repeating what I just mentioned there. She joined the Women's Art Club of New York, the American Watercolor Society. By the 1870s and 1880s, we also had professional associations being organized for women and for women artists. And so as soon as you had schools opening up, you had professional associations that could help to support women, right? They would come together to organize and to provide and create opportunities for one another. And so that infrastructure is really what helps to build a growing generation of female artists. Now, this painting is somewhat unusual in Hearst's output. She's most well known for her compositions that would have appealed to male audiences. They often presented masculine subject matter, like the bookworm's table that you see on the left, and adopted this hyper-realistic trompe-l'oeil style that was very popular with male consumers. She would paint things like meerschaum pipes, books, and other forms of kind of gentleman's study sort of studies. And in fact, she became really popular as a client for many of the men's clubs in New York, who would commission her to paint paintings for their interior decoration. Now, in contrast, Adelheid Dietrich was born in Wittenberg, Germany. She studied flower painting under her father. Again, we have a woman learning from a family member. And she followed in the tradition of Dutch flower paintings and the work of her contemporary, the German artist Severin Rosen, another artist who immigrated to America and whose flower and fruit pieces were highly praised. Dietrich probably immigrated to New York around 1870, and she exhibited in both coasts. She exhibited in Brooklyn and in San Francisco, and created these incredibly abundant floral compositions, including this one in 1871, replete with insects, billowing blooms, and this mountainous landscape in the background seen from an open window. And if you've had time to admire this in the exhibition, I think it's spectacular. You can pick out the honeysuckle, the iris, the various different varieties and forms, the purple columbine, the different flowers. Her precision is incredible and all inspired by nature. Now, what made these still lifes so appealing to American audiences? Well, during this period in the middle of the 1800s, ideas about landscape began to shift. And you have a move from sort of private estates to public parks that were designed by horticulturalists and landscape gardeners who employed a growing body of knowledge about plants and their propagation, and really a kind of social shift about an idea that every citizen should have access to public space, that beautiful open spaces should be enjoyed by all. Horticulture, the art and science of growing fruit, vegetables, and ornamental plants, became hugely popular, again, by the 1840s. By 1820, you see an image of it here in the bottom left, Congress established the U.S. Botanic Garden in Washington, D.C., signaling a national interest in plants and their propagation. And figures like Andrew Jackson Downing, considered the sort of father of American landscape gardening and architectural design, extolled the landscape as something every citizen should enjoy. Downing promoted a tradition that was made popular by British landscape designers, like the absurdly named Capability Brown, who believed that the landscape informed how people felt and how they moved through the world. In addition, you had things like the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, which included Horticultural Hall and showcased thousands of exotic plant specimens and domestic ones for audiences. Not long after, the Burpee Seed Company was founded, which became the largest global mail-order seed distributor in the world. And you see 3 examples of their seed packaging advertisements from the 1890s. So all of this is happening in the background at the same time that Adelheid is painting pictures like this, and Claude is painting peaches. And so this idea, or this movement about landscape, becomes popular through all of these different kind of connection points. The Peel sisters, Hearst and Dietrich, filled a desire for still life paintings, either of fruits and vegetables or exotic flowers and insects, and they forged careers publicly exhibiting and selling works like those on the open market. Now, some female artists, and it's worth noting, why still life? Well, a lot of people say if you were a busy wife, mother, it was much easier to paint a still life. You could come back to it. You could leave the scene out. You could work from your subject and then take a break when you needed to. So we have women who are working as professional artists. They're members of associations. They're exhibiting. Some female artists of this generation were trained by male family members but did not seek to sell their works for profit. Artists like Evelina Mount, who was trained by her uncles, William Sidney Mount and Shepard Alonzo, preferred to create paintings like these and give them to friends as gifts. Art as the family business also applied to Lucy Maria Durand Woodman and Anna Richards Brewster, who both learned to paint under their fathers. And here we see William Trost Richards painting Summer in the Adirondacks from the exhibition with his daughter, Anna's painting of the New Hampshire landscape. Anna married a man as well, William Brewster, who was very encouraging of her profession, although she never achieved the kind of success that her father did. Asher B. Durand, again, another artist who trained his own daughter, Lucy Maria Durand Woodman, whose work we see on the right of Delaware River, Sparrows Bush, Pennsylvania. Durand also unusually took on many other women students, including Mary Josephine Walters, whose little jewel-like painting of a sort of bower scene in the forest and wooded landscape is in the exhibition, and which takes the style of Durand in an incredibly kind of detailed cathedral-like direction. Now, artists like these, or examples like these, again, show that there were women artists who were being trained, in some cases, familial relationships, but in others, clearly male artists who saw women as equals who could achieve success in their field. A few key developments influenced this expansion of career opportunities for this generation of female artists. First was the sort of opening up of the landscape, the creation of tourism spaces, and the second was changing ideas about women's roles and women's fashion, which allowed them to get out into the outdoors and access these spaces that could then be painted and pictured. So here we see two stereo views from the exhibition, and it may be hard to see, but there are little built-in support structures for people to climb down on top of the waterfall. And in this group over here, a group of people, including women, standing underneath the ledge looking out at the waterfall. So the landscape became more accessible and women's opportunities expanded all at the same time, making landscape painting possible for professional artists. Artists like Fitzhenry Lane also took on studio assistants like Mary Blood Mellon, whose work we see on the right. Lane, a Gloucester-based artist, trained at least 2 women in his studio, and it's increasingly being learned that Mellon had a fair hand in the creation of some of Lane's compositions. Thomas Moran met his wife, Mary Nemo Moran, while the two were both students. And we have paintings like Thomas's Oil of East Hampton paired with Mary Nemo Moran's etching of the same scene, which show the successful career trajectories of both artists, married partners who created similar kinds of work. It's worth noting, of course, though, that gender often bifurcated these opportunities as much as they may have made them possible. Mary Nemo Moran was an incredibly skilled etcher. She initially, though, started out in painting, but she found she couldn't keep up with the work in the studio, the requirement of working at like a wet surface. So she turned to etching because it was a faster process that was also more forgiving of her unusual schedule, keeping house and raising children. Like the female artists detailed thus far, local women artists also pictured the regional scene. Artists like Mercy Etta Baker, whose views of Horseneck Beach are incredible jewel-toned watercolors. Theodosia Potter Chase's view of the Dartmouth Peyton Aram Salt Works, or Elizabeth Haven Appleton's scene of Walnut Street in New Bedford from 1850. Each of these women found expression within art and the landscape and captured the world around them. Emily Noyce Vanderpoel is a really interesting example of a woman who had extraordinary success as a landscape artist. She was a member of the New York Watercolor Club and Women's Art Club, and a prominent color theorist who exhibited at the Women's Building at the 1893 World's Columbian Fair and published Color Problems, a practical manual, in 1902, where she was one of the first to think about color theory in art. She studied here in the area with Robert Swain Gifford, and we see works of hers and his paired together in the landscape exhibition. Gifford taught several female students, including Vanderpoel and Frances Eliot, who he married in 1873. Born in New Bedford, Fanny studied art in New York City and Boston, and then after they were married, bore 5 children who survived to adulthood and pivoted from, again, doing oil paintings to doing watercolors and etchings because printmaking was more forgiving on her schedule. Now, during this same period, her husband, who was also a working artist, traveled to Algeria, Venice, France, Florence, Denmark, Germany, and Quebec, all while she was at home caring for house and children. So, women were getting along here, right? They were progressing, but opportunities still varied. Fanny's sketchbooks, however, show or demonstrate how women were getting out into the land. En plein air pencil drawings of the Catskills in upstate New York show her careful attention to detail and how observant she was about the world around her. Women like these and countless others whose sketches and paintings were not saved, their names unrecorded, pictured the landscape with great frequency and skill. They were among many who found inspiration in the American landscape and conveyed its beauty for audiences. So as we have seen, these women artists pictured landscape and its flora and fauna in diverse ways. And as women's opportunities expanded and grew, so too did the ways in which they pictured the scenes around them. Women, especially white middle-class women, had these increasing opportunities, and those who wanted to were able to study and travel in the natural environment. Now, it's important to state that most of the women considered tonight had advantages that enabled them to exceed societal expectations. They were white, they were largely middle or upper class, and as Linda Nochlin wrote in 1971, quote, "In actuality, as we all know, things as they are and as they have been, in the arts as in 100 other areas, are stultifying, oppressive, and discouraging to all those, women included, who did not have the good fortune to be born white, preferably middle class, and above all, male," end quote. It would be decades more before female artists of color, such as Clementine Hunter, Gwendolyn Bennett, and Norma Morgan, could forge careers as landscape artists. And it's only now, in the 21st century, that many of these women have begun to achieve recognition. So as we think about this story, it's important to think about who we've looked at, and even in that, who is being left out of those stories as well. So thank you all for joining tonight for this exploration of women in landscape. I do hope you'll have an opportunity to come back to the exhibition and study all of the works that we just looked at in more detail before the show closes on May 14th. So thank you.